Well, today it's goodbye to Abraham, as from now on in the book of Genesis, the focus gradually moves from Abraham to Isaac. And if we were carrying on through Genesis, in the next chapter, we would see the death of Sarah. And after that, Abraham sending his servants to find a wife for Isaac from his own kinsman. And then finally, the death of Abraham, who was buried by Isaac and Ishmael. This section that we're in doesn't really end until we get to chapter 25, verse 12, which says, "These are the generations of Ishmael." And you might remember from when we started Genesis ages ago that Genesis, which was not written in chapters and verses, these are late editions to help us find our way around, Genesis had its own means of dividing itself up into sections. And it did that with 10 phrases, which was, "These are the generations of," beginning, "These are the generation of heavens and earth." And gradually, as it goes through, it comes down to "These are the generations of Jacob," which is how the book of Genesis finally ends with Jacob, or also known as Israel. So that's where the book's going. But because I've been focusing on Abraham, and he is now going to fade out of the story, I'm ending with this chapter. And it is a very uncomfortable chapter. And it would be even more uncomfortable if we ignored the chapters before, which we've already looked at. You see, someone reading this in isolation might think, is it God playing a cruel tug of war with about whom do you love most, your son or me? And with any passage in the Bible, it's always good to look back and see what led up to it, and then look forward to see if later passages shed any light on the things we might have missed. And for that reason, that as well as Karen reading Galatians chapter 22, verses 1 to 19, I also asked her to read Hebrews chapter 11, 17 to 19, which highlights what was really being tested here. And also James chapter 2, 20 to 23, which talks about the evidence of faith and how this passage in Genesis is an example of that. So anyway, first to this chapter in Genesis, which begins after these things. So this is now an indefinite time span. We don't know how long after these things happened after the sending away of Ishmael, which we looked at last time. And there is, in fact, parallels between this chapter and the last one. Because in the last chapter, God told Abraham to send Ishmael away. And Abraham, rising early in the morning, got a skin of water and bread, and later on his son Ishmael, and he was sent away into the wilderness, and where he was near the point of death. And then he was saved by the angel of the Lord. And there is a similarity between that passage and this, where it appears that Abraham now is being asked to lose his only other son. I say an indefinite time span. There is a Jewish tradition, which I don't think is quite right, which reckons Isaac would have been 37 years old by now. And that tradition was based on their thinking that Sarah died out of shock when she heard what was going on. But there's no evidence for that whatsoever. But amongst the original readers, they felt there could be quite some time. But it's quite clear that Isaac has grown up enough to carry quite heavy loads. So Abraham is tested by God. Now I have on my hand a wedding ring, which when we bought it, I was assured was 18 karat gold, which I think means 18/24 gold by weight, 3/4, 75% gold. At some point that would have been checked and the ring marked with a hallmark to confirm it did indeed have that amount of gold in it. And there are ways in which metals are tested, and in the ancient world, often that was done by melting them, and you can tell the purity of a metal and the composition of an alloy partly by the temperature at which it melts, and also other things. So testing is a way sometimes of finding out what something is, and often it's very uncomfortable. So what is being tested here? Well, it's Abraham, of course, but what character of Abraham would be tested? Some chapters ago, we had the statement, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. And I said then, but how do we know that Abraham believed God? And you could say, well, because it tells us here, clearly God knew, who God knows the heart. But what evidence did we have that Abraham believed. And then a little after that, Abraham was told by the Lord that these blessings would come through his son Isaac, born by Sarah. And Abraham presumably believed that. But how do we know that he believed? And you may ask, how does God know? Well, that seems a silly question, because God knows everything beforehand. But after Abraham is tested, these things become evident, and effectively Abraham gets his hallmark to say, yes, his belief was genuine. Now, going back to the way that metals are tested, tests can improve them as well. And in the New Testament, where it talks about God's people being tested, that is the purpose of tests there. It is to purify and refine the things which are right about them, is to refine their trust in God. And here, it is mainly a demonstration to us and all the powers that be, that Abraham does have genuine faith. But unless Abraham was a completely unfeeling cold fish, and that's clearly not the case from the way this is written, this would have had an effect on Abraham as well. This would have stretched his trust in God. So let's see how this proceeds. So God calls to Abraham, he calls him by name, and we get this response, "Here I am," which is a kind of, if we were in a kind of military setting, it's like where the commanding officer calls out someone's name, and you get present, or aye, sir, yes, sir, or whatever it is. Abraham is here ready to respond. And then he gets this dreadful command: take your son, your only son, whom you love. 3 references to his son, increasing in intensity. Your son, only son, whom you love. And it's a bit like the very first thing that we saw Abraham was commanded when he was told to leave his country. Go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to the land that I will show you. And now he is to take his son, and it's clear from the way he's written this that the Lord knows he loves his son Isaac. Take him and go to the place that I will show you. Now we might balk a bit at your only son Isaac, because there was Ishmael, who was Abraham's firstborn, but he's already lost Ishmael. He has been sent out, and he goes off to form his own nation. So Abraham has already lost Ishmael, and Ishmael was never the one through whom God's promises were going to be fulfilled anyway. So Isaac is the one who is classed as Abraham's firstborn, even though he is not, and he is effectively now Abraham's only son, his only begotten, loved son. And go to the land of Moriah. Well, I wonder what's special about Moriah. It's clearly important to God that he's being sent there. We'll come back to that. And when you get there, you are to offer him as a burnt offering. A burnt offering is one that is wholly given to God, as it's completely burnt up. Other sacrifices later in the Bible would be partially offered to God. The fat parts would be burned, but the rest would be food for the priests. But a burnt offering is entirely destroyed. And Isaac's body is to be completely destroyed by his father's hand. There is to be no doubt that Isaac is dead and that he has been wholly given to God. And there are huge questions here. Child sacrifice may have been practiced then, it certainly was later on, but surely we can't believe that the Lord would demand such a thing. And after reading the previous chapters in Genesis, this seems to contradict the Lord's promises, because Isaac is God's son, the chosen son to carry forward the promises given to Abraham. And Abraham has had it drummed into him year after year that it is through Isaac that the promises will be fulfilled. Now, Isaac's birth was an impossible one, and now it seems his future surely will be, if he is dead. Is the Lord, through the death of Isaac, making his promises even more dependent on the God who does what we cannot? We are not told what goes through Abraham's mind. You can see this is where we mustn't try to understand the passage in isolation, because it is after those many, many years of waiting, it's now become a settled fact with Abraham that God's promise is depending on Isaac, and those promises will be sure. So the test is, can Abraham believe that the promises will be fulfilled through Isaac, even though Isaac is put to death? So can you see now the point of the writer to the Hebrews in the New Testament? Does Abraham trust and obey? Trust enough to do this thing? And we see in this passage he is. He's enough to prepare the wood and take his son to Moriah. And Hebrews, you see the writer to the Hebrews says, well, clearly Abraham is demonstrating that he believed in the resurrection of the dead. And in a sense, says the writer to the Hebrews, he did get him back again. And perhaps more quickly than Abraham would have expected. You see, even if Abraham believed that God could and presumably would raise Isaac again in order to keep the promise, he did not know God's timetable, which had been very long up to now. He might lose his son for a very long time. So, whatever Abraham believed, there is a personal cost to him. No matter how much Abraham believed, he is still giving up his son and putting God before his son. And Abraham didn't shrink back when his trust was put to the test. And Hebrews, the book of Hebrews' point overall, is that neither should his readers shrink back. His readers, whom the writer to the Hebrews calls the offspring of Abraham. And he reassures them in the book of Hebrews that they too will receive the promise of life in the Lord's presence forever. So hold fast to what you've been taught and believed about what Jesus did. Do not shrink back. Oh, and sacrifice him there, offer him there on one of the mountains of which I shall show you. So not only does God have a specific place, but a specific mountain. And we get a clue as to why this mountain later in the passage. And we see Abraham's response in verse 3, that he arose early in the morning, saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and went to the place which God had told him. It's a reasonably long journey, and it's on the 3rd day that Abraham sees it. Now, just a little digression here. It's always interesting to have a look at phrases which occur again and again in the Bible. And if you were reading through the Bible regularly, you would come across this 3rd day many times. I did a word search because I've got the English Standard Version online. And I said, how many times does the phrase 3rd day occur in the Old Testament? Answer, 33. How many times does the expression 3 days occur? Now, the reason why I included that as well is although for us in English the 3rd day and after 3 days are different, that is not the case in the Hebrew mindset. So they are alternatives. And that's why I summed in those as well. And I find there are 66 occurrences in the Old Testament of either on the 3rd day or 3 days. And to show their equivalent, this 3rd day and after 3 days, I'll just quote from Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. And when he takes the throne, all the Israelites come to him because they found it very hard to serve under Solomon. He was a very expensive king to serve. So they come to Solomon's son and they say, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. Rehoboam said to them, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away, and Rehoboam took advice from Solomon's advisors and got good advice, which he ignored, and went to his young friends who gave bad advice, which he took. And then it says, so Rehoboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the 3rd day, as the king said, come to me again the 3rd day. But we've just read, it says, come to me, go away for 3 days. So in Scripture, the 3rd day and after 3 days is the same. You'll find the same thing coming up in Matthew 27. After the death of Jesus, the Jewish leaders go to Pontius Pilate the morning after, and they say, you know how this impostor said after 3 days he would rise again, therefore set a seal on the tomb until the 3rd day. And in the Gospels we find sometimes in one Gospel Jesus says, after 3 days the Son of Man will be raised from the dead, whereas the same conversation in another Gospel says the Son of Man will be raised on the 3rd day. So, The Bible seems to like this expression, and we find usually wherever it occurs, it is something significant which happens on that third day. It might be it's preparing us for something which comes later. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and we've come across this expression before. This is where somebody sees and spots something significant, perhaps they haven't noticed before, and now he sees the place from afar. He's not quite there. There's the four of them and the donkey, and I assume the donkey was there to carry the sticks and the provisions they would need for their 3-day journey. But now it's just to be father and son. Even the donkey stays behind. As Abraham says to them, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come back to you. 3 verbs: go, worship, come back. And those 3 verbs have the same subject: we, I and the boy. So Abraham is saying to the men, we will go there, we will worship, and we will come back and worship. This act they're doing is for God. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, presumably off the donkey, and laid it on Isaac, his son. So Isaac is clearly old enough now to carry a heavy burden. Perhaps Abraham himself is too old. One thinks they could have used the donkey, but it so happens that Isaac has to shoulder the wood for his own execution. Wonder where that's going. His father carries the means of execution, the fire and the knife. It is the father's initiative. Well, after God, because God told him to do it. And Isaac doesn't yet know. And they both go together. And here we have the intimate scene of a father and son walking together. And the son says to his father, my father. And the father says, here I am, my son. I'm ready for you. What's your question? And the question is, we've got the fire, we've got the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Yeah. And then we get this rather strange answer from Abraham. God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son, the lamb. So they both of them go off together. Is Abraham avoiding telling Isaac what's going on? Whether he is or whether he isn't, what Abraham says will come to pass. Isaac still doesn't know then where this lamb's going to come from, but he appears to be satisfied that the lamb hasn't been forgotten. And when they come to the place of which God had told him, Abraham carefully builds the altar. He lays the wood and then binds his son on top of the wood. Now Isaac knows. What was said between the father and the son, we aren't told, but Isaac must be in some way willing, as I'm sure he's going to be faster on his feet than his father would be. Especially when his life's at stake. Yeah. There's an Aesop's fable about, I think it's a fox chasing a hare or a rabbit, and the fox fails to catch the rabbit, and somebody tells the fox, well, you weren't very good, were you? Yeah. And the fox says, what you have to remember is, I was running for my dinner, the rabbit was running for his life. And you would think if Isaac wanted to escape, he could well have done. But the focus is still on Abraham. And now Abraham reaches out his hand. He takes the knife and is about to slaughter his son. We have reached the awful climax of this story. It is quite clear that if Abraham is not restrained, he will kill his son. And then we get the angel of the Lord calling to him, saving Isaac as Ishmael was saved in the last chapter. The angel calls to him with his name twice. This is commonly done in Scripture where attention is being, the attention of the person is being drawn. The young boy Samuel in the temple, when God speaks to him, Samuel, Samuel, because he has an urgent message for him. Before that, when Moses turns aside to see this non-burning bush, the Lord calls out to him, Moses, Moses, stop. This is holy ground. So you get this double call when this means stop what you're doing right now. And Abraham responds, yes, sir, here I am. And then we get the statement from this mysterious angel of the Lord, who sounds very much like the Lord himself. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. Now I know. Well, God's known that all the time. But in one sense, it's not exactly a hypothetical knowing, but it's a knowing which has not been demonstrated. And now, by putting Abraham to the test, and Abraham acting in the way that he has, Abraham has demonstrated to everyone that what God is known about his faith is indeed true. He does respect God. He does fear God. That doesn't mean to say he's afraid of him, that God is someone whom he will please, who he will serve at any cost. Since, says the angel, sounding like the Lord, saying, you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. God recognises the personal cost, the wrestling which has probably gone on, and the, I feel like the greatness of Abraham in passing this test. Now, human sacrifice by another human being was never going to be allowed, though Abraham did not know that at the time. So his son is safe, and always was. And now, through this, Abraham has demonstrated his faithfulness, and he gets his hallmark, so to speak. He is indeed a man of faith. Abraham believed God, now it's confirmed. For trust will always demonstrate itself in obedience. Disobedience now would have been a sign that Abraham's belief was in word only. So can you see James' point in the New Testament? You see, he knew that many in the churches he was writing to claimed to have faith. They claimed they had a faith to justify and deliver them from judgment. But that faith wasn't leading to godly behaviour. Where then was the evidence for their faith? How, if you like, could they justify their claim to have faith? You see, with Abraham we have proof. It was not that his obedience justified him, for James knows that the declaration that Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness came many years before this incident. He was already righteous. But rather, James is saying that the actions, the works of Abraham, showed that his faith, testified about many, many years ago, was indeed genuine. And it says his faith and works were working together. That is, Abraham needed faith in order to obey. And he obeyed because of his faith. For if you trust in what God says, but not do as he says, how can you claim to be trusting in him? So now Abraham's faith, testified to many, many years before, now bears fruit. And by his offering of Isaac, Abraham shows that statement, Abraham believed God, was indeed a justified statement. His faith in this act is shown to be genuine. So too, says James to his readers in the book of the whole, your faith, if genuine, will show itself in good works. A sterile faith, which produces nothing, is no faith at all, and it is not the kind of faith that Paul talks about in his letters. So that is how two New Testament writers have drawn out applications for present-day Christians from this passage. So, continuing with this, but there is a central point to this as well, which you may have already twigged. But continuing now from verse 13 onwards, Abraham lifted up his eye, this expression again, and lo and behold, behind him is a ram caught in a thicket by his thorns. Not a lamb, not a young lamb, a male adult.
Yeah.
The Lamb of God has been provided. And Abraham calls the place the Lord has provided. And for some reason, by the time Genesis is published, this expression becomes a byword because we have the author's note here. Thus, as it is said, to this day, that is this day when Genesis was published, on the mount of the Lord, it will be provided. So now we're getting some clues as to the identity of this mountain as well. It is the mountain of the Lord. So where is it? We think it was about 50 miles north of where Abraham started in Beersheba. 45 as the crow flies, perhaps 60 miles walking. And in those days, 20 miles a day was normal walking, so it is about 3 days' journey. Now, the descendants of Abraham, when they returned to that place, would find a fortified city on a hilltop site, very difficult to attack. And I think the mountain that city was built on was Mount Zion. And it's a city which David eventually took to be his capital. It was a city of David. And to the north of that was Mount Moriah. And the surroundings to the west would all become included as part of Greater Jerusalem. And Mount Moriah is mentioned again later in the Bible, in the time of Solomon. It's in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 at the beginning. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father at the place that David had appointed on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. No reference to Abraham there. But if we go back and say, well, why did David pick this site? Well, this was a site where David had seen the angel of the Lord, that figure again, acting in judgment against his people, whom David had illegally taken a census, and a plague breaks out. And David prays, and he has this vision of an angel with a drawn sword standing over Mount Moriah. And David is commanded to provide an offering on Mount Moriah. And as he lays the altar and puts the animal on top, fire falls and consumes the sacrifice. And he sees in his vision the angel of the Lord put the sword back in its sheath. Judgment has been averted because judgment has fallen on a substitute sacrifice on Mount Moriah. And that is what the Lord provided. And that is where Paul built the temple, maintaining peace, as it were, between God and his people, a place of continual sacrifice until the living temple appears and makes peace by his one sufficient sacrifice. And being sufficient, it never has to be repeated. So that's the significance of this place, which we pick up as we gradually read through the rest of the Bible. And going back to Genesis, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time. And we have this paragraph which begins, because you have done this, and ends, because. So the unconditional promise, this promise here was the promise which was given to Abraham way back, and the promise which Abraham believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Then it was an unconditional promise of God. Now the Lord attaches it to Abraham's obedience as well. The unconditional promise is now a reward for Abraham's faithful obedience, his putting the Lord ahead of his most prized son. And at the end of that, Abraham returns to his young men, and they went back to Beersheba, another 3-day journey. And that's where Abraham lived. So for Abraham, the trial of his life is over. And this is also the pinnacle, if you like, of the story of Abraham as well. You see, this father, in the end, did not have to sacrifice his beloved son. No one would be asked to do that again. But what God the Father asked of Abraham the father was less than what he, the Lord, and his son, his only son, his only beloved son, would do near that mountain 2,000 years later. Isaac was the offspring of Abraham, and there is in this paragraph a promise that Abraham's offspring will possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. But Isaac wasn't the one who would possess the gate of his enemies, and Isaac wasn't the one in whom all the nations of the earth would be blessed directly. But he was a foreshadowing of the final son of Abraham, who would carry on his shoulder the wooden crosspiece of judgment, bearing the judgment of all his people, so that in him all his people from all nations would inherit the blessing, being God's people under the blessing of God, and eventually in God's presence forever. Again, 2,000 years later, on the road to Emmaus, Jesus walking alongside 2 of his disciples, beginning with Moses, and by beginning with Moses he means the books of Moses, including Genesis, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. I wonder if Jesus used this passage. But can you see that the whole Old Testament testifies to the ultimate offspring of Abraham, who must suffer and die, must be sacrificed that his people may live. And if we see that, how will we live in response? So I think it's fitting to finish with a hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross.